CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The inaugural Africa Climate Summit ended in Nairobi with an urgent call on the global community to speed up climate action. The gathering that brought together several African leaders, global climate ambassadors, and representatives from many sectors culminated in the adoption of the Nairobi Declaration, which Africa will take to COP28 in Dubai as its common position. This week on the program, we examine the outcomes of the first ever truly African climate gathering on the continent by asking, is Africa's climate agenda on track or is it stuck in a rut? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. To delve deeper into the outcomes of the summits and their implications for Africa, I'm joined by Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen, UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for Egypt and UN Special Envoy on Financing 2030. Dr. Mohideen, thank you very much for joining us here. Now, the Africa Climate Summit has just ended here in Nairobi. First off, it had a declaration. What, in your view, were the outcomes of the summit?
Well, I think the first thing to be recognized is the ability of Kenya to host such an important summit and to keep the momentum on matters related to climate and development, including aspects related to finance of development and green growth in such tough global political environment. So the very convening of the event and the excellent attendance by leaders, heads of government, private sector and civil society in itself was a success. Then on the substance, as reflected in some aspects of the declaration, I think matters related to priorities of Africa had been reflected as being emphasized in the declaration and in the statements by heads of state, that issues related to finance, technology, and capacity development need to be taken more seriously, especially through partnerships. What I liked as well is this kind of unique and practical way of linking global efforts to regional cooperation and checking from the very beginning the impact on local communities. I didn't miss a day without having this kind of serious discussion, what would be the impact of all of these discussions at the grassroots, at a typical household in a poor area or in middle class areas in Africa. And this issue of social impact, I think, was a plus in the discussions.
Two issues that actually were very much in focus as well, together with what you've just talked about, climate financing and green growth. But if we look back at the whole question of climate financing, though, because 12 years ago, there was a pledge by richer countries to give the poorer countries about $100 billion. But, where are we with that progress?
Well, two things. First, 100 billion, very important as a token of trust. In terms of significance, perhaps, as you said, more than a decade ago, this amount of money was significant. But if everybody is saying now that the gaps are in the trillions, so when you consider the 100 billion, even if they are being paid in full, which has never been the case so far, even if they are going to be leveraged, this is not going to be adequate. So the 100 billion is being taken serious in the discussion from two aspects. First, it's an issue of commitment and political trust. Second, in areas related to leveraging. And I would say third, because everybody's going to be now considering what will be the new figure of the climate finance beyond 2025, when this new figure is going to be discussed, and definitely it will be much more than the 100 billion. I know that there is a report being now finalized on the commitments by the advanced economies, but I can tell you from now, there will be a very huge dispute about the findings of this report, as it happened in the previous reports, because the methodology being adopted is basically allowing everything that is being provided from the north to the global south as part of the 100 billion. Loans, grants, investments, even high cost kind of funding are being considered. And there are issues related to double counting, if not multiple counting. That's why you see entities like Oxfam is challenging these reports. But actually, what I like now about the discussion of the climate finance is going beyond the 100 billion, linking the work to development finance, trying to get as well all sources of finance, external and domestic, public and private, and making a focus on innovative finance, or what's called finnovation.
So there were some new pledges that were made during the Africa Climate Summit, right? About $25 billion. Is that a new line of financing?
Well, part of that is part of the old commitment. And part is like what we have seen, for instance, from the pledge and the promise coming from the UAE, 3.5 billion. This is not part of the 100 billion. So this is additional finance. And what I like about that offer is coming with an interesting mix, because Africa doesn't need more debt. As you know, many countries now in Africa are facing a variety of challenges, even crises when it comes to debt. What we need is one of two things, or both: more private equity participation and more concessional long-term finance. Commercial debt is not really a good recommendation. I've seen in some discussion that some advanced economies recommended that we can go on green bonds and blue bonds. This is fine as far as you can get them on long term, and with great deal of support for the cost of funding, not to be on double digits as we see today, but we need really to have more support for issuance to be more long term and more concessional. And it is not fair to ask Africans, especially when it comes to funding adaptation to climate change, to be funded by commercial terms, including actually the high risk associated with the commercial borrowing because of exchange rate.
So Africa is now gearing up for COP28,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
in COP27, Africa was looking for, their focus on a just energy transition. As we gear up to COP28, where are we with the just energy transition?
I think the discussion has been very much advanced, but the implementation is leaving a lot to be desired. So in terms of discussion, I would say that now people, you may remember the big announcement during Glasgow about funding through JETP $8.5 billion plus to South Africa, phasing out from coal, phasing in renewables, and checking the impact on society. I think now the discussion got more sophisticated by reversing that order, checking what would be relevant and what would be the impact first on society, on neighborhoods, on the labor market, then availing the finance for the alternatives. And then you can consider and practically and fast, the phasing out. But you tell me, well, I'm phasing out this without really getting the phased in alternative. That's not really practical. On elements of just energy transition, I was happy to be the moderator of the session that took place during COP27 between the President of the European Council and the President of South Africa as co-chairs of this session. And issues related to better identification of the requirements at the local level have been very well identified. You cannot just talk about these matters generically. And you cannot just move on and say, well, we'll compensate the victims. It doesn't really go this way. So I think in the design of project finance from the very beginning, this issue of the social impact and the socio-economic opportunities need really to be realized. Then the other thing as being emphasized almost by every head of state, that at their very big challenges, there are many opportunities, especially in renewables. On the Atlas of Wind, many African cities and provinces have proven that they have the comparative advantage of hosting big wind farms. Solar, we are blessed with the sun and with the kind of circumstances that can really make solar energy feasible.
So I come back to my first question now, where
Yeah.
I asked you about the outcomes.
Yes.
Now I want to ask you about, in your view, what exactly did the Africa Climate Summit achieve?
Well, I think if we go back to what we said at the beginning of this year, it's a year of challenges because the impact of COVID, we're talking about climate as an urgent matter, but we are overwhelmed by food, energy, and debt challenges and crises. So to have a summit that is trying to make climate and climate finance part of the solution to these overwhelming challenges and crises on debt, food, and energy, that was a plus. Second, it's taking the issue of incremental support of the climate agenda and its dynamics from the Paris summit a few weeks ago. And I think it achieved more definitely for Africa, I would say. Then this is coming days before 3 summits in the UN discussing sustainable development goals, their progress and the halfway towards 2030, finance for development, and the Climate Ambition Summit. And many of those who are coming here as if they are getting their priorities reorganized from a regional perspective to go with one voice, one African voice to the UN. And then everybody, of course, is preparing for the COP28, which this year, and this is basically through you, to those from government or private sector to NGOs, as we're discussing, for instance, with the Marrakesh partners just now, myself and my colleague Razan al-Mubarak, please go there with prepared asks and offers. This is not the time for generic perspective. This is the time for specific, and as you try to do as well, if you can attach your offer or your ask to a dollar sign, that would be even more appreciated to get an adequate answer, no or yes, for these offers and asks.
And what will be Africa's common position this time in COP28?
Well, I think linking climate priorities to sustainable development and the focus on that impact at the local and communities level had been an area of emphasis, that climate finance is development finance. There is no dichotomy whatsoever between climate and development, and we need really to have inclusive green growth with opportunities for job creation and opportunities for sustainable development, while we are not compromising the targets on net zero and the climate agenda at large. This has basically been the common thread on many of the leaders' statements and had been reflected in different ways in the declaration, I would say.
Dr. Mohideen, thank you very much for that. On that note, let's take a short break. When we come back, we will have more from this historic gathering by looking at what lies ahead for Africa in the fight against climate change. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our conversation. Joining us now is our panel of experts. Fadel Kaboub, President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and Suleiman Babamanu, Nigerian Program Director at RMI. Both of you, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Professor Kaboub, let me start off with you because I want to start by taking stock of the just concluded Africa Climate Summit. First of all, what exactly did it achieve?
Well, in 2 words, it's been a missed opportunity. This is the first Africa Climate Summit organized by the African Union on African soil. And I expected as an African economist, our leaders to deliver a bold, transformative, coherent, comprehensive vision on climate and development. And what we ended up with are vague statements repeating statements that we've seen in other declarations and statements that didn't really meet the expectations of civil society of the African people. And when I put the official declaration side by the People's Declaration from civil society, you can see a huge gap in ambitions, in focus. And that's unfortunate, because we wanted to invite the world to come to Nairobi to witness our ambition, our bold vision, not to come veto our ambition and vision.
What would that vision, though, have entailed?
Well, a vision of transformation that says two things. Number one, climate action is development policy. It's not two competing things. Number two, stating the facts, which is historic polluters owe us climate reparations, owe us a climate debt. And that reparation is not just transfer of financial resources. Yes, it involves cash transfer to repair the damage, but also it involves transfer of technology. It involves addressing the structural traps that have been established for this continent since the colonial and post-colonial times. And those are three major structural traps that we still struggle with today. Number one, food deficits. We used to be the breadbasket of the world, and now we import 85% of our food. Not by accident, by design. Number two, energy deficits. Even for a country like Nigeria, a big exporter of fossil fuels, Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline. Not by accident, by design. So repairing these structures. And number three, this is the most important one, is the industrialization deficit that we have, whereby we've been assigned the role of either exporting raw materials with no value added or assembly line manufacturing. So we export low value added content, we import high value added content. We're constantly in a trap. No matter how much you double, triple, quadruple your exports, you're always digging yourself deeper. So repairing the economic damage involves, coincidentally, climate solutions, because this means investing in food sovereignty and agroecology, which is a climate solution and a development solution. Investing in renewable energy infrastructure, and that's a climate solution and a development solution. And investing in high value added manufacturing, using our strategic minerals to deploy clean energy, clean cooking technology on this continent. That's a solution for climate, that's a solution for development.
So let me bring in Suleiman here. Suleiman, I want to get your view here. What is Africa's agenda here?
To a certain extent, I kind of agree that, you know, this would have been this is a huge opportunity for Africa to really take a stand. But to a certain extent, I also think that for the first time this summit is holding in Africa, we have seen African leaders actually taking a united stand in terms of what they want to achieve all together in the conversation around climate change. Now, when you look at that, Africa, this is a shift from, you know, Africa being considered as a victim of climate change because of the amount of emissions it is responsible for compared to, you know, the developed countries, which is around between 3 to 4%. So there's a shift from that being a victim to taking also a lead in being a solution. So that I think it's a huge step. And maybe lastly is on around the kind of, you know, mandatory carbon taxes on polluters, because there should be responsibility in, you know, people who countries that are polluting most to be responsible for financing.
Suleiman, I want to come back to you here with that whole concept of exactly how much money is needed or how much money has been pledged. It's not the first time that Africa or the global south has heard about money being pledged by the richer countries. And you know, if climate financing is to be achieved, if the energy transition is to be achieved, you know, they're talking about I don't know, billions of dollars that is required to do this for Africa. Is that money actually available, considering the $100 billion that was pledged by richer countries for adaptation and mitigation is yet to be realized?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that since, you know, when the declaration was made, I believe in COP19, up to now, we're yet to be able to see the actualization of the $100 billion that's been committed, and it still remains a responsibility of developed countries to, ensure that that financing is made available for projects and for climate change related issues. But when you look at also, there are a lot that needs to be done for countries to be able to access this financing. And these financing must be made available in a way that becomes attractive and not become additional burden to African countries, especially because of, the amount of debt that African countries are already, in right now. So, and that is one of what this summit has been been working on, in terms of really looking at restructuring the financing to the way that it is able to actually get to the right, to make the right impact. Access to this funding also requires that you have, been able to prepare a pipeline of projects that would be able to attract this financing. But it must also, have a blend of, concessional financing and grants, and, a structure that typical commercial capital will not be able to necessarily finance because of the nature of these projects. So, but I think, a lot needs to be done by developed countries to actualize this commitment.
So, Professor Kabub, we heard a lot about, some pledges of up to $25 billion. We also heard about, like the UAE, for instance, pledged about $4.5 billion towards Africa's renewables. But when we talk about the barriers that have traditionally, disadvantaged the continent, what are these barriers that have not enabled the continent to access the funding?
Well, this is not the first time we hear pledges in the millions and billions, and 25 billion is still too little and too late. But also the devil's in the detail when it comes to the structure of this financing, the conditionalities that come with this financing. I'll give you one example. One of the largest solar farms on this continent in Egypt was funded through a loan by a European bank to 12 European companies to build this solar farm, and then to produce clean electricity to sell to Egyptian consumers at a premium, and then to generate revenues and profits and to repatriate them back to Europe at a fixed exchange rate. No matter what happens in the Egyptian economy, they're guaranteed a fixed exchange rate in US dollars. So Egyptian consumers are practically importing clean electricity from European companies that produce the electricity on their own soil. So if we're talking about climate finance of this kind, this is perpetuating the neo-colonial and colonial extraction of African resources, and it's not going to get us very far. So if we're talking about climate finance, like the 100 billion promised, not delivered, 80% of it was delivered in the form of loans that are entrapping our continent in the same structure. Even if we say, okay, we're going to give you solar panels for free to build the farms. Right. That's still technological dependence, because after 25 years you have to buy them. You have to borrow money and buy them again. So we're talking about transformation and reparations in the form of transfer of technology, industrialization on this continent using our resources. Right. And then finally, when we talk about the global financial architecture that underpins this entire system, it was created in 1944 when the entire continent, with the exception of a few countries, were colonized. Right. So it's a global financial architecture that was not designed by us or for us, and it can't be the architecture that will save us today. So we have to not only fight and demand not charity but reparations for the damage that was done to our economies, to our ecosystem, but also make sure that we redesign a global financial architecture that's balanced.
Suleiman, do you see the continent achieving that 100% green growth by 2030, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very ambitious target, right? And I mean, for us at RMI, we always believe that, countries, states and local governments, for example, have the right to, utilize the resources to be able to achieve economic development. However, what is also very important, what is key, is using data-driven techno-economic analysis to prove that, especially for countries that abundance of oil and gas, that it can actually be a cheaper alternative to utilize green technologies. However, there are a lot of, when we talk about the numbers in terms of access gaps, it is not going to be immediately addressed using decentralized solar solutions, for example. So, other resources must be utilized to be able to address those gaps. So it is an ambitious plan. It is achievable. However, with all the, breaking in terms of commitments and, a huge gap that we have in terms of access and clean cooking, one gets really, really worried that, for countries that have not been able to, generate up to 10, even 500 megawatts or 1 gigawatt of clean electricity, targeting 300 gigawatts of electricity over the next 10 years. So, it calls for a lot of, collaboration with governments and financial institutions to be able to achieve that.
All right, so I want to get your final thoughts here. And Professor Kabubu, let me start off with you, because this was a precursor to Africa's position at COP28. What should Africa be taking to COP28?
Well, unfortunately, I don't really see this as a common, united, concrete position. If anything, maybe Africa had a more of a clearer common position last year at COP27. So we have a lot of work to do in the next couple of months, working through the African Union, through the African group of negotiators, who are our representatives and experts going to COP to better shape and formulate a common African position and a set of demands, because this loss and damage fund that was created last year that is empty, that the agenda for this year is to make sure that it's fully funded at the scale necessary for the transformation necessary for Africa and the global South. But what we've heard in the last few weeks from John Kerry in the United States is that the United States will not pay reparations for climate, which means will not deliver anything to the climate fund. That's what's implied. And he was dispatched to Nairobi to deliver peanuts, $25 million with an M, not with a B. And even that is questionable. Is it actually 25 or is it just 5 on top of the 20 promised a while ago? We have to be very clear on our demands and united, and not shy away from calling out historic polluters when they don't deliver, and expect them to set the agenda for COP28 and beyond. All
right, Suleiman, your thoughts. What should Africa take to COP28?
Yes, I agree with Professor. I think it has to be a very clear, consistent message, right? We run the risk of, losing this momentum, the little momentum that we have right now if countries continue to default on their responsibilities. And it only gets to a stage where, you begin to see, countries pulling out of, any kind of, negotiations or commitment. And what is also very, very important is these financing are also based on our terms, right? And not subjecting us to additional, debt kind of, challenges that would end up, being a problem rather than a solution to the already, bad situation.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both so very much for that analysis of the African Climate Summit. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Professor Fadel Kabubu, President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Suleiman Babamanu, Nigerian Program Director at RMI, and Dr. Mahamoud Muhyiddin, UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for Egypt and UN Special Envoy on Financing 2030. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.